We are now being joined by our correspondent, Julia Chapman. Julia, thank you so much for joining us. The meeting is underway. What can we expect going forward?
Well, the two leaders are expected to be discussing bilateral trade, investment, cooperation in the energy sphere, among other bilateral issues. But they'll also be talking about some of the global issues that have been confronting the two countries in recent times. This is only the second video call that President Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have held this year. There's been minimal high-level engagement actually between Russia and China, although that probably says more about COVID restrictions than about their relationship, because there's no doubt that Russia and China have been moving ever closer. Certainly from Russia's perspective, China has become a very important partner indeed, as Russia becomes increasingly isolated from the West due to what the West perceives as aggressive action on the world stage. But certainly trying to boost their bilateral trade will be a big priority. You alluded to a rise in bilateral trade this year on last year. There was a dip last year related to the pandemic, and there have certainly been some trade complications, particularly at the border with China, the land border, which has been closed for a long time now to even many goods coming from Russia over COVID fears. But the two countries are aiming for a $200 billion trade turnover by 2025. That has looked like a distant prospect for some time, but it is of the utmost priority to Russia and China as a symbol of their ever-growing relationship.
Right, absolutely. Now, Julia, we've seen lately President Putin's aggressive stance when it comes to the NATO. How will that affect the relationship going forward, especially in the region, with respect to this breaking news alert?
Well, President Putin is unlikely to get any outright support for the way that he has been approaching the West recently, but it will be very covert support, we could say. It would be more along the lines of offering Russia a way to turn when it becomes more isolated from the West. So although there have been difficulties with the Russian annexation of Crimea, of course, Russia has been pursuing a very difficult strategy towards the West, which NATO and other Western European countries see as a very aggressive one. And that has really been coming to the surface in recent weeks, of course, with the US accusing Russia of a military buildup along the Ukrainian border. And that has led to tensions rising between Russia and NATO countries, with both sides making threats. NATO countries saying there could be huge economic sanctions threatened against Russia if there are any invasion of Ukraine going forward, which Russia, of course, denies. But Russia is concerned that NATO countries are going to start positioning missiles in Europe, in Ukraine specifically, which, of course, NATO denies itself. But Russia has met that with some serious concern. And, of course, as all of this is going on, Russia is still maintaining its friendship with China. A closer partnership has been growing. And certainly with an economic partnership that has been developing over time, it does give Russia more alternatives, more room to turn when things become difficult in the West.
Absolutely, Julia. Now, we've seen the US make a very clarified stance when it comes to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. They have clearly sided with Ukraine, especially the territorial integrity of Ukraine. How will that affect the geopolitics going forward?
Well, certainly it is a very difficult moment for Russia. Russia sees this rise in support for the Ukrainian government that has actually really developed over the past year, ever since Joe Biden came to power in the US. The US has taken a much more active stance in defending Ukraine against what it sees as Russian threats. And of course, Ukraine has increased its engagement with NATO. Of course, it's not a NATO member. It has aspirations to become one, although that is still a very long way off. And all of this closeness has led to more confidence, you could say, coming out of Kiev, which has led to more concern here in Moscow. Of course, the West would dismiss Russia's concerns, saying that they are not necessarily legitimate. But of course, Russia does see things very differently from the rest of the world. And that has certainly shifted the balance of power in Europe, and that has led to Russia expecting guarantees from NATO to not expand to include Ukraine Ukraine or Georgia either, both two countries, former Soviet republics that Russia doesn't want to see get any closer to the Western orbit. But Russia has also recently been putting forward proposals for a new European security pact. And that is something that there has been some engagement with from the Biden administration. Joe Biden said last week that he was going to try to arrange a Russia-NATO discussion because, of course, the channels for dialogue have really become very limited since NATO expelled some Russian representatives to the NATO bloc in Brussels, and then Russia closed its delegation altogether because it said that that was an unreasonable step from NATO. So there have been very few channels for discussion, and Joe Biden is certainly trying to open more up to avoid any kind of incidental confrontation between Russia and NATO countries.
Right. Now, Julia, my next question for you is that the Kremlin has confirmed that the Ukraine border, as you just rightfully pointed out, will dominate the talks. And the two leaders are also going to discuss the US and NATO's collective rhetoric, which has been dubbed as aggressive. What more can you tell us about this?
That's right. The Kremlin will certainly be raising these issues. As I say, China is unlikely to give any kind of overt support for Russia's position. It more acts as a friend when there is need for one. But certainly President Putin is expected to raise what the Kremlin has dubbed aggressive rhetoric from the West. Of course, the West accuses Russia of aggressive rhetoric when it comes to Ukraine. But there is no doubt that this will be one of the main talking points for the discussions going on between the Russian and Chinese leaders. And certainly this will be a big problem for Russia going forward. It wants to try to engage more with President Joe Biden. It's pushing for an in-person summit with the US president in the new year. But of course, that will come only when the US is ready for one. It hasn't confirmed any such plans for one. But certainly we are seeing more engagement between Russia and the West, but also between Russia and China now going forward, with President Putin expected to attend the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics in February.
Julia, another question for you. The European Commission head has just said that EU supports Ukraine and is ready to expand sanctions against Russia in cooperation with its partners in case of any kind of escalation in this conflict. Now, these remarks are coming as the talks are on. How do you perceive these recent comments coming in from the EU?
This has been a line that has been reiterated time and again by Western countries ever since they have perceived a growing threat from Russia towards Ukraine in the last month or so. They've made it very clear that any consequences of a Russian invasion, which I repeat, Russia denies any intention of carrying out, would be economic rather than military. Of course, Ukraine is not a NATO member. It is not entitled to mutual support, mutual defense under Article 5, according to the NATO agreement, but many threats have been issued from NATO itself, from the United States, from European countries about Russia, towards Russia, if there were to be any kind of invasion. But those would be largely economic ones. And we've seen many rounds of economic sanctions issued against Russia for the annexation of Crimea, for a number of other issues as well. But this does seem to be a stepping up of the threats, with the US saying that Russia could be cut off altogether from the global payments system, SWIFT, which would have a huge impact on ordinary Russians. So certainly the threat is a very large one, very significant one indeed, if there were to be any kind of incursion on Ukraine's territorial integrity.
Absolutely. Julia Champion, thank you so much for all your inputs, and thank you for joining us from Moscow on this story.
WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.